Hyper-imperialism, a dangerous decadent new stage. January 2024. Introduction. It has been a scant 30 years since the end of history was declared by bourgeois ideologists in pantomimes of wish fulfillment for sensing the inviolability of United States imperialism. For people struggles and movements feeling the boot of imperialism on their necks, no such end was in sight. In the face of violent repression, such as Brazil's Caracas massacre in 1996, the landless workers' movement led the reclamation of land for popular agrarian reform through occupation and production, challenging agribusiness behemoths such as the US multinational Monsanto. A soldier who shook the continent, Hugo Chavez won the popular vote in 1999, a sharp left turn that was followed by others in Latin America. This included a wave of mass mobilization of millions of workers, peasants, indigenous women, and students that defeated the proposed US free trade areas of the Americas in 2005, a direct challenge to nearly 200 years of the US Monroe Doctrine. In 2002, the Nigerian women gathered at the gates of Shell and Chevron to protest environmental destruction and exploitation in the Niger Delta. Haitians refused the centuries of denegations in mass demonstrations following the U.S. ousting of Jean-Bertrand Aristide and U.S. occupation in 2004. Millions of Nepalese celebrated the toppling of the monarchy through armed resistance under the leadership of the communists in 2006. When fruit vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in 2010, the Tunisian people revolted against the neoliberal system that had caused him to take such extreme measures. In subsequent years, changes, sometimes small and imperceptible, at other times volatile and explosive, unfolded. These involved both popular movements and state actors, in some cases extremely powerful ones. The US was confronted by a rising economic powerhouse in China, growing economies in the global south, which overtook the global north's GDP in PPP terms in 2007, years of domestic capital investment neglect, the financialization of the economy, and the loss of manufacturing superiority. The rise of the Tea Party in 2009 signaled internal fracturing of US domestic politics. Internationally, the US failed to achieve soft regime disruption in China and denuclearization or regime change in Russia. After a temporary reduction in military spending with the end of the disastrous war on Iraq 2003 to 2011, the US shifted to the use and threat of military power as a central pillar of its response to these changes. Hegemony is historically lost in three stages: production, finance, and military. The United States has lost hegemony in production, though it still has some remaining areas of technological hegemony, including those related to the military. It is seeing its financial hegemony challenged, though still in the very early stages and revolving around the status of the US dollar. Even though the economic and political aspects of its decline might be accelerating, it still retains military power, creating a temptation for the US to attempt to overcome the consequences of its economic decline by military or military-related means. The US has defined China as its strategic competitor. The minimum program of the US is the containment and economic diminishment of China, sufficient to guarantee the US's own perpetual future economic hegemony. From its own point of view, US capitalism is rational in its attempt to limit China's rise. Failure to do so would erode the relative advantage the US has in controlling higher levels of productive forces and the resulting monopoly privileges that control entails. There's almost complete alignment amongst the US state actors to continue to manage decoupling from China, despite the near impossibility of fully remodernizing US productive forces domestically, and to advance military preparations against China. The February 2022 movement of Russian troops into Ukraine, a result of the continued violations of US assurances on the non-expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the continuing civil war between Kiev and Donbass, marked an explicit new phase in world military alignment for the US. In a series of rapid-fire moves, the US openly subordinated all the global North countries and, in so doing, further subordinated the military apparatus of those states. It established itself as the open military hegemon of what is euphemistically called NATO Plus, which includes all but three members of the former Eastern Bloc. Those who attended the 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, as a member or observer, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, are de facto members of NATO Plus. Only Israel, excused from attendance for political expediency, and a few smaller countries of the global north did not attend. Beginning in October 2023, Israel began a campaign of displacement, ethnic cleansing, collective punishment, and genocide of Palestinians, with the full and shameless support of the United States government. The developments in Ukraine, followed by the recent escalations in Gaza, are significant markers reflecting that there has been a qualitative change within the imperialist system. The US has now completed its economic, political, and military subordination of all the other imperialist countries. This has consolidated an integrated, militarily focused imperialist bloc. It aims to maintain a grip on the global south as a whole and has turned its attention to dominating Eurasia, the last area of the world that has escaped its control. It is not a matter of exaggeration to say that the global north has declared a state of open hostility and war on any section of the global south that does not comply with the policies of the global north. This is seen in the joint declaration on EU-NATO cooperation published on 9th January 2023. Quote, "We will further mobilize the combined set of instruments at our disposal, be they political, economic, or military, to pursue our common objectives to the benefit of our 1 billion citizens." Unquote. The Palestinian people in Gaza are certainly feeling the palpable barbarity of NATO Plus and the forced mass consensus of which the global north is capable. As Palestinian liberation leader Laila Khaled put it recently, "We know that they speak about terrorism, but they are the heroes of terrorism. The imperialist force everywhere in the world, in Iraq and Syria and different countries, are preparing to attack China. All of what they say about terrorism turns to be about them. People have the right to resist with all means to it, including the armed struggle. This is the Charter of the United Nations. So they are violating the rights of people for resistance because it's their right to restore their freedom. And this is, and I say it always, a fundamental law. Where there is repression, there is resistance. People will not live under occupation and repression. History taught us that when people resist, they can keep their dignity and their land." Unquote. Imperialism has begun its transformation to a new stage, hyper-imperialism. This is imperialism conducted in an exaggerated and kinetic way, whilst also subject to constraints that the declining empire has foisted on itself. The spasmodic quality of its exertion is felt by the millions of Congolese, Palestinians, Somalis, Syrians, and Yemeni living under US militarism, whose heads instinctively jerk for cover at sudden sounds. Yet this is not the full-blooded march across the globe that the Cold War initiated, fought in proxy battles that were followed by economic imperialism through the World Bank and other development institutions. It is the imperialism of a drowning billionaire who firmly believes he ought to be back on his yacht. It flexes the muscles of power that are still strong, the military. However, absent productive power and knowing that financial power is at a tipping point, the full suite of imperial technologies of control that the US once had is no longer at its disposal. It therefore channels its effort through the mechanisms it has most at hand: culture, the control of truth, and war. The tactics of hyper-imperialism are shaped partly by the modernization of hybrid warfare, which includes lawfare, hyper-sanctions, seizure of national reserves and assets, and other manners of non-military warfare. New technological tools of surveillance and targeted communication characterizing the digital age are deployed to wage imperialist control of the battle of ideas. This has involved implementing more perverse and covert methods against the truth, such as the political imprisonment of WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, who exposed numerous crimes against the global south. The Global North is an integrated military, political, and economic bloc composed of 49 countries. These include the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Japan, and secondary Western and Eastern European countries. In the military arena, Turkey, as a NATO member, the Republic of Korea and the Philippines, de facto militarized colonies of the US, are included in our definition of the US-led military bloc, even though they are part of the Global South. Over the last 20 years, the Global North has endured a significant relative economic decline, along with a political, social, and moral decline. Its false moral claims of civil rights and press freedom are now complete mockeries as they seek to make illegal the public, including online, support for Palestinian rights. This full-on support for the humiliation and destruction of the darker peoples of the world is reminiscent of past centuries, exposing what can be described as collective white fragility. The Global South countries comprise former colonies and semi-colonies, a few non-European independent states, and current and former socialist projects. The struggles for national liberation, independence, development, and total economic and political sovereignty still needs to be completed for most of the Global South. Despite the limitations of the terminology, we will use the term Global North and occasionally the West, an often used hollow phrase, interchangeably with the more accurate term of the US-led imperialist camp. We will analyze the Global North in four rings. The rest of the world is currently known as the Global South. Much of it was previously called the Third World. We will analyze the Global South in six groupings that are determined by the relative degree to which a country is a target of regime change and the role its government plays in public advancing international anti-imperialist stances, both in Figure 1. The Global North is engaged in much higher levels of generalized conflict with the rest of the world, the Global South. Figure 1. Global North rings and Global South groupings. Part 1. The rise of a complete US-led Global North military bloc. Shifts and consolidation. The US-led military bloc has two internal changes in the last 3 decades. 1. The further expansion of the bloc to include all Eastern Europe countries, only missing Belarus. 2. The challenge to retain the full subordination of the Western European capitalist states, which abandoned any fundamental, and in many cases even the pretense of, independence. The latter became evident in 2018 by the Western European states' genuflection to Donald Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, a significant blow to their economic interests. Further down, we will discuss the history of this process. The center of the US-led military bloc, as we call it, is NATO. It also includes Japan, Australia, Israel, New Zealand, 3 Global South countries, and a few other European countries who are not NATO members. The US-led military bloc is the world's only bloc, a de facto and de jure military alliance with a central command. There is no other bloc of its kind. Its clarity and unity of purpose are sharply evident. The US has abandoned many important anti-nuclear proliferation treaties over the last 10 years, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, and Open Skies Treaty in 2020. This has allowed military planners to potentially prepare for the placement of intermediate-range nuclear missiles capable of obliterating Moscow in minutes. Figure 2. Actual world military spending 2022. Military spending. In the November 2023 issue of Monthly Review, a well-researched paper by Gisela Quenadas and John Bellamy Foster, using only U.S. official economic statistics from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Office of Management and Budget, OMB, revealed that the actual U.S. economic military spending is over twice that acknowledged by the U.S. government or even the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. The actual 2022 U.S. military expenditure was $1,537 billion. To calculate the world total military expenditure, we have selected SIPRI's published numbers as our primary source for all countries except for the US. For the US alone, we use the figures from Monthly Review. In 2022, SIPRI adjusted the Chinese government reported national defense budget number of $229 billion to $292, a 27.5 increase. Starting in 2021, SIPRI began a new methodology of revising China's military spending. SIPRI changed their calculation for China's military spending both for previous years and current years. SIPRI adjusted the U.S. annual military budget reported by the OMB for the year 2022 by 14.5% up from 765.8 to 876.9 US dollars. This was about half of the percentage increase added to China. SIPRI's treatment of China's military spending is quite different from how it deals with the US, as it adopts a much more circumspect approach to US calculations. Even if SIPRI doubled the military spending reported by China itself to $458 billion, it would represent 2.6% of its GDP. This is significantly below the actual 6% spent by the US, and even then, China's military spending would be only 29.8% of that of the US, with a population over 4 times greater than the US. Additionally, unlike the US, China does not have 902 overseas foreign bases. US bases and interventions create a drain not only on the annual budget, but also on the long-term economic debt. Additional details can be found in the endnote. What emerged from our analysis was a series of clear findings. The first is that the US controls, through NATO and other means, an astounding 74.3% of all military spending worldwide. Figure 2. This amounts to over $2 trillion. Figure 3 shows that the imperialist countries account for 12 of the top 16 military budgets in the world. Figure 4. Actual per capita military spending of top 16 global north countries, Russia, China, and India, 2022. Figure 4 shows the 16 highest military per capita spending by global north countries versus the 3 largest global south military spenders. The United States spends 21 times more on its military per person than China does on its military. There can be no doubt as to the significance of these findings. Figure 5 lists all countries that have military budgets exceeding 20 billion US dollars, 11 of which are in the global north compared to 6 out of 145 countries in the global south. For this chart, Republic of Korea is listed under the US-led military bloc. It is clear that the global south, in contrast to the global north, is not a bloc and certainly not a military bloc. The global south thus faces the extreme monopoly of military spending by the US-led military bloc. This represents a clear and present danger to all countries of the global south. It presents an imminent danger to the continued existence of humankind and the planet. In turn, the single most important aspect of state power, that is, military power, the absolute central danger to the working classes of all countries, especially to the darker nations of the world, lies in the US-led imperialist camp. Objectively, there is no such thing as sub-imperialism or non-Western imperialist powers. Such concepts are subjective deceptions that cloud over the factual realities. Figure 5. Countries with military spending exceeding 20 billion US dollars. US and UK military bases. In March 2002, Monthly Review published an article with a list and map of countries with known US military bases, arguing that the extent of the US empire could be depicted by its bases. This created a storm in some US military circles. Others have expanded on this work in subsequent years, including David Vine and World Beyond War, which was made an interactive map publicly available. The information about the location of these bases opened a window onto the absolutely pervasive nature of US military hegemony. The location and number of bases is valuable for understanding the shape and trajectory of imperialism by illuminating its frontiers and showing its role in policing them. There are 902 known US military bases and 145 known UK military bases described below. Due to the secrecy of the US military and government, there is a lack of data on US military functions that occur inside these bases and the actions launched from US military forces located there. This makes a full qualitative analysis of US foreign military activities incomplete. Some of the analytical deficiencies include that listed bases exclude the facilities and locations of the many privatized military functions that the US has created over the last 40 years. Companies such as DynCorp International, Fluor Corporation, ACOM, and KBR Incorporated run operations worldwide, including in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. They do not include unofficial projects by the US military, like the commandeering of Terminal 1 in Kotoka International Airport in Ghana's capital city, in which US soldiers do not need passports or visas to enter, only their US military ID, and US military aircrafts are free from boarding and inspection. Terminal 1 is thus a de facto US military base. Ghana has ceded national sovereignty to the US. They exclude essential projects for the US military industrial digital communication complex. Many undersea cable terminus locations are controlled by US intelligence cleared officials only. Control of the undersea cable communications of the world is one of the key US intelligence priorities. This is part of the NSA Collect It All program to gather all communications of the world and store them in places like the Bluffdale, Utah data center, codenamed Bumblehive, the first intelligence community comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative data center. They exclude secret military projects and locations, including host nation facilities known as lily pads, although some have been exposed and included. There's little information regarding US military movements between locations, the nature of the activities carried out, such as troop movements or targeted assassinations, and the volume of goods, planes, and vessels. Not all bases are equal in scale or function. Assessing relative importance is near impossible. Sometimes a single building is classified as a base because it is discontiguous from other buildings a kilometer away. Some bases are massive and destructive to everything in their path, like the military facilities in Guam, destroying the natural environment and the lives of people living there. Others are known as small spy network installations. The result of these limitations is a tendency to report on what is measurable, not what is unknown but strategic. Figure 6. 902 United States foreign military bases. First, we provide a map using World Beyond War data that shows which countries have bases without showing the exact number in each country. This helps to reduce possible incorrect comparisons. The existence of even one US base within a country means that the country has already ceded some national sovereignty to the US. Second, for completeness, we include below two charts, one for the global north and one for the global south, that list countries with known bases as per World Beyond War. Figure 6 shows the US has at least 902 foreign military bases. They are heavily concentrated in bordering regions or buffer zones around China and seriously undermine the sovereignty of Global South countries. Figure 7. United States military bases in Global North countries and territories. US foreign military bases not only exist in the Global South, but also have a significant presence in the Global North, Figure 7. More than two-thirds of known bases are concentrated in the two countries defeated in World War II, Germany and Japan. Figure 8. United States military bases in Global South countries and territories. Figure 8 lists the locations of U.S. foreign military bases in Global South countries and territories. The Republic of Korea hosts 62 permanent U.S. military bases. Figure 9. United States foreign military structures. Figure 9 shows the scale of the U.S. military footprint, 36 million square meters in 49,000 buildings covering 245,000 hectares. Ranked by number of buildings, the three Axis powers are in the top 4. Figure 10. 145 United Kingdom foreign military bases. Whilst the sun now happily sets without concern for the British Empire, Figure 10 shows how large the UK network of base remains, with its focus on West Asia and Africa. US and UK military invasions, interventions, and deployments. NATO countries conduct extensive military deployments and interventions worldwide supported by their vast network of bases. Figure 11. Foreign military deployments for each global North power. Figures 11 and 12 are for the year 2022 only. Imperialist forces deployed 317 military operations in Global South countries and 137 in Global North ally nations, totaling 454, 45 of which are not UN member states. The imperialist nations who carried out the highest number of military deployments include the US, 56, the UK, 32, France, 31, Italy, 20, Germany, 17, Spain, 15, Canada, 13, and the Netherlands, 13. Figure 11. Figure 12. Global North military deployments in the Global South. Figure 12 shows how Africa and West Asia remain the focal points of Western schemes, with the following 5 nations suffering the most military deployments in 2022 alone: Mali 31, Iraq 30, Lebanon 18, the Central African Republic 13, and South Sudan 13. Looking at the geography of US and UK bases and Global North deployments, it is clear where the frontiers of US policing lie and how Eurasia and regions that buffer it are the battlegrounds of our time. Figure 13. United States acknowledged use of armed forces abroad. Figure 14. United Kingdom military invasions abroad. The US and its global North allies, especially the UK, have had centuries of interventions as indicated in figures 13 and 14. Since Congressional Research Services (CRS) is an official US government publication, it serves as a primary source of data on US military intervention. It is used to demonstrate the scale and historical longue durée of US military intervention. However, it must be noted that CRS does not include secret missions and does not aggregate its data to differentiate between various types of US armed forces overseas interventions. The data is not organized based on the qualitative and quantitative nature or scale of the instances. The listed instances, over 480, vary greatly in size, duration, legal authorization, and significance. The Military Intervention Project, MIP, uses a more comprehensive definition of military intervention that encompasses united instances of international conflict or potential conflict outside of normal peacetime activities in which the purposeful threat, display, or use of military force by official U.S. government channels is explicitly directed toward the government, official representatives, official forces, property, or territory of another state actor. MIP has not published their database, so exact instances of all the military interventions they identify are not yet publicly available. As such, this report has only accessed summary data from the publication Introducing the Military Intervention Project, 2023, and could not produce a map based on MIP. As seen in Figure 13, as of June 2023, the acknowledged data from the U.S. Congressional Research Service shows that the U.S. Armed Forces have been deployed to 101 countries between 1798 and 2023. Figure 14 exposes the UK, who has militarily invaded 170 countries and territories between 1169 and 2012. According to MIP, between 1776 and 2019, the US carried out over 392 military interventions worldwide. Half of these operations were undertaken between 1950 and 2019, and 25% of them occurred in the post-Cold War period. The pace of US military intervention has clearly accelerated since 1991. On International Working Women's Day in 1950, Claudia Jones, a black communist and immigrant woman, addressed a rally of activists in the US. In different circumstances but with the same spirit, we share this report with the aim, to quote Jones, of, quote, heightening our consciousness of the need for militant united front campaigns around the burning demands of the day against monopoly oppression, against war and fascism, unquote. Part 2. Evolution of Imperialism. The new stage of imperialism. The US dollar monopoly and the switch from creditor to debtor nation that began in the 1970s, followed by the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, ushered in a period where the United States attempted to create a self-crafted unipolar world order. Unipolarity could not be fully established because states, which the US called rogue states, refused to submit to this new system. Over the past 15 years, the project of US unipolarity has been greatly weakened. The period between the Great Financial Recession of 2008 and the February 2022 conflict between NATO and Russia has consolidated a quantitative and qualitative change in global imperialism. A key historical question flowing from this has been the depth and consequences of inter-imperialist rivalries. This has deep strategic and political implications. Will other imperialist powers break with the US on fundamental issues or subordinate their own interests to those of the US? Today, the facts show these differences are no longer strategic. Imperialism has consolidated a new stage of existence best described as hyper-imperialism. Later we explained why we chose this term. Some of the features of this new stage include the following. China has emerged as the largest and most dynamic economy in the world. The growth of the global south exceeds that of the global north. Gross domestic product (GDP) growth in Asia is significantly higher than in the G7 countries. Despite its remaining economic strength, the US is facing meager growth and is declining relative to the rise of the global south, with China's growth being a major locomotive. This is evidenced by the total GDP, industry, trade, infrastructure, and 5G communications. The US is making aggressive attempts to curtail China's economic growth and its role in global initiatives such as BRICS 10. The US is leading the world into increased protectionism. The US has rapidly advanced hybrid warfare, including US sanctions inflicted on more than 1 in 4 countries around the world. The US seizure of national reserves from Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and Afghanistan has been a rude awakening to many in Global South. The US has now set its sight on the domination of Eurasia, where the West faces Russia and China, two powerful countries with a combined strong economic, technological, military, energy, and food capacity. The complete demilitarization of the long border between China and Russia and their announced no-limits partnership is a testament to both countries' common interests in peace and security. There is a clear and present danger that imperialism will continue its militarist path and rely on its military dominance to offset its growing relative economic and political decline. The political and military interests of the imperialists have now become paramount. Short-term economic losses are being taken. The interests of individual capitalists or groups are secondary. US dollar hegemony, financialization, and technological ability allow finance to move trillions of dollars in trades in milliseconds, which has changed the mechanics of capitalist accumulation and its ownership. European and Japanese capitalists invest their capital in the same structures as those of their US class brethren, albeit under the control of the latter. The US enhanced its already vast soft power infrastructure based on the rise of a new generation of advanced social media and video streaming, under the full control of US monopolies, all of whom are explicitly integrated into the US military-industrial digital complex. The contradictions between the imperialist countries are now non-antagonistic and secondary. Germany, Japan, France, and all other imperialist powers must subordinate their short-term and medium-term interests to the fundamental interests of the United States. Their work is coordinated in NATO+. Official policy documents state that their strategy on China is to de-risk. Yet, Germany's Bundestag officials, for example, are leading the calls for the isolation of China, even though that entails a considerable loss of markets for German manufacturers. There's also a simultaneous internal drive to remilitarize Germany. New multilateral institutions and alternative development financing models emerging from the Global South are gaining momentum. This is evident by the breadth of support for the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the growing interest in joining BRICS, now BRICS 10. Nearly 80% of UN member states participate in the BRI, comprising around 64% of the global population, with their combined economies representing 52% of the world's GDP, purchasing power parity in 2022. BRICS 10 countries now encompasses 45.5% of the world population, with 35.6% of the share of the world's GDP, PPP. In comparison, though the G7 states, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, and the US, account for merely 10% of the world population, their share of the global GDP, PPP, is 30.4%. The Global South is losing confidence in the US and Europe's economic, political, and moral leadership. China, not the US, facilitated Saudi Arabia and Iran's breakthrough diplomatic agreement. Russia and China now conduct most of the trade between the two countries in their own currencies. BRICS 10 is setting up a working group to explore alternatives to the use of the US dollar, including international payment systems and a possible new reserve currency. On the vote for the UN resolution on a ceasefire in Gaza, the global north was outnumbered, with 14 votes against and 120 in favor. For the first time in over 600 years, there is now a credible economic and political alternative to the domination of world affairs by the Europeans and their descendant white settler colonial states. First is the socialist grouping led by China. Second are the growing aspirations for national sovereignty, economic modernization, and multilateralism emerging from the global south. Given these shifts, leaders of the US political ruling class at the Center for New American Security, CNAS, the Washington-based think tank, and the US government's intellectual core have defined US geostrategy as the dual defeat of Russia and China, which would mean that the global north would gain control of Eurasia. The size, share of natural resources, military power, geographic proximity, and independence from imperialist domination of China and Russia are the key factors in their respective global outlook and strategic partnership. These objective factors are much more dominant than the ideological ones. The US wants to accomplish their unfinished mission of denuclearizing Russia. There are maps hanging in Washington that have been drawn to show both countries broken up into small chunks, vassal states of the West, without independence and certainly without nuclear weapons. Figure 15, United States Geostrategic View of the World. As pictured in Figure 15, China, Russia, the DPR, Korea, and Iran are the four nuclear or potentially nuclear powers that are at the center of the frontline attack from imperialism. China and Russia are the top two targets, the former due to its economic strength and the latter due to its nuclear arsenal. Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, and Belarus are also immediate targets for regime change. The world faces a very difficult and dangerous moment. Countries in the global south are highly diverse and heterogeneous, do not form a bloc, and are not ideologically aligned. They certainly have no military alliances. Some, the Republic of Korea and the Philippines, have become enmeshed in the US military sphere. What they do have is a shared history. They have suffered hundreds of years of colonial and semi-colonial abuse by the global north. The whiter nations have spent the last 50 years trying to airbrush from history the terror they unleashed on the world's darker peoples, including those who live within their own borders. Western media revels in the vast differences within the global south. The Group of 77 and the non-aligned movement, despite being weaker, continue to exist. The developments towards a stronger sense of shared identity among global south countries cannot be easily dismissed. The demand for national sovereignty is deeply democratic. It remains a crux matter for improving the lives of the popular classes in the global south and is also a necessary step towards socialism. The First World War ushered in the Russian Revolution, 1917, followed by the creation of the Soviet Union, the world's first fully functioning worker state, and a wave of revolutionary national liberation struggles. The Second World War ended with the creation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, 1948, and the People's Republic of China, 1949, which were followed by another wave of national liberation struggles that included important socialist victories such as in Vietnam, 1954 and 1975, and Cuba, 1959. We are not living in a comparable period of revolutions today. Yet there is a clear new mood and an awakening of the spirit to advance the incomplete national liberation projects that began in the two previous periods. The domination of the Western neo-colonial system is being questioned. We are witnessing changes not seen in 100 years and entering a new period of history. Summarily, we can say that there are 8 main contradictions evident in the world. Moribund US-led imperialism versus emergent China-led socialism. Parasitic rent-seeking capital versus society's requirements for environmentally sustainable development, industry, agricultural, and employment. US-led imperialism versus the urgent necessity for national sovereignty of the socialist and capitalist countries within the global south. The ruling classes of the global north versus the bourgeoisie of the capitalist countries in the global south. The white supremacist ruling class of the G7 and the rest of the global north versus the popular classes, workers, peasants, and lower petty bourgeoisie in the darker nations of the global south. The bourgeoisie and upper strata of the global south capitalist countries versus the popular classes of the global south. Western imperialism versus the future of the planet and human life. The internal contradiction between the global north bourgeoisie versus millions of the working class, poor and increasingly growing sections of the skilled and semi-skilled in the global north. As we have already begun to do with the military, we attempt here to analyze this new stage of imperialism, the internal functioning of the imperialist camp, and to examine the global south's composition and connotations to understand the world's primary contradictions today. Conquest, Racism, and Genocide: The Common History of the Imperialist Camp. Figure 16. Common History of Imperialist Countries 1492 to 1945. The wealth of the global north originated from historical theft through violent dispossession over centuries. Figure 16. Economic stagnation and demands for growth spurred the looting of resources from other regions. This began as early as the military invasions of the Crusades against Arab and Muslim areas of West Asia, 1050 to 1291. The end of the European medieval warm period, which lasted from about 950 AD to 1250 AD, and the catastrophe of the Black Death, 1346 to 1353, tilted things in favor of peasants away from the aristocracy. The peasant rebellions and charters of the forest throughout Europe were a sign that capitalism's future was far from sealed. Europe then commenced its trajectory as a world hegemon through its militarized maritime powers, beginning as early as 1415 with Portugal's invasion and capture of Ceuta, a fortified Moroccan port, a date we use to mark the now over 600 years of Western domination. The first European colonial power, Portugal, used Genoese capital to fund its expedition, and the rest of Europe followed suit in the 1400s. The conquest of the darker nations of the world, the subsequent dispossession of peoples from their lands, and the subordination of their labor saw racial ideologies emerge. This ideological layer infiltrated the base and superstructure of both European societies and peoples they conquered. It is most pronounced in the white settler colonial states, which were racial projects from the very beginning of their existence. Within these white settler colonial states, the US and Israel now represent the most acute, permanent, and deeply ingrained history of racial religious projects. Economic analysis shows that the real rise in capitalist investment in the UK began when slavery's profits and plunder of countries such as India enabled the historic rise in fixed capital investment and was decisive in so-called capitalist primitive accumulation and the financing of the Industrial Revolution. In a 2022 study, Utsa Patnaik indicated that the UK extracted 45 trillion US dollar using a compound interest rate formula since it remains unrepaid from India between 1765 to 1936. The overwhelming bulk of leading UK institutions profited from the transatlantic slave trade. The racial ideological underpinning, in turn, has shaped the later development of both capitalism and imperialism. Over the centuries, Europe created several further white settler colonial projects outside its historic core in the Americas and Australasia, including in Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. The successful ones did not do so by settling on uninhabited land, the myth of terra nullius, but rather through genocide and military conquest, in creating majority white populations and states. Germany perpetrated the first 20th century genocide, murdering approximately 80,000 Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia between 1904 to 1908. Five of these remain today: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel, all projects of Britain, the latter having begun its colonial conquests in the mid-1500s in Ireland. Britain's role in the Americas resulted in the creation of the United States of America. The infamous British Balfour Declaration, 1917, was central to the formation of Israel at the expense of the then UK colony Palestine. The Zionist mission needed to create in Israel a barrier to the barbaric hordes of Asia. No other nation is as influential in the US as Israel. The US, due to its size and role, remains the dominant force of world terrorism, but Israel has an outsized role in violence and military spending. It has nuclear weapons that the Western media conveniently downplays. From creation to modern times, the US has been defined as a racial project. In American Holocaust, The Conquest of the New World, 1992, David E. Stannard estimated that within the first 150 years of the European conquest of the Americas, as many as 100 million indigenous people may have died because of the conquest and its aftermath, including disease, warfare, and enslavement. By 1860, nearly 4 million black people were slaves in the US alone. In 2022, over 720,000 black people were incarcerated in US prisons and jails. Black people represented 38% of the prison population, despite being only 12% of the US population. The US has nearly 20% of all prisoners in the world, despite having only 5% of the world's population. Over 500 years after slavery began, with the earliest record arrival of a slave ship in 1519, the US still puts tens of thousands of black people in solitary confinement, despite this being considered a form of torture by the United Nations. It was only in 2013 that the state of Mississippi officially ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, first officially noted in the Constitution on 6 December 1865. We can only understand the ideology of the US ruling class by recognizing the racialized character of its class structure. The 2023 NATO declaration and the unified support for Israeli genocide against the Palestinians is ample proof that imperialism cannot be divorced from historic racial aspects. For over 600 years, European and white settler states have sought to and succeeded in dominating the whole world. Since World War II, the US has sought to extend this rule for at least a millennium. Initially, all the states within the imperialist camp were white. With the absolute defeat of Japan in World War II, including using atomic bombs, Japan was assimilated into the imperialist camp, eventually achieving what the South Africans coined honorary white status. This was particularly possible because Japan was a previously fascist power that also tied its imperialist expansion to racialized practices. Imperialism also has racialized patriarchal foundations, which trace back to how the sexual division of labor, the control of women's reproductive capacities, and the exploitation of women's unpaid work were reshaped within Western colonization as preconditions for the international expansion of capital accumulation. From then to now, gender-based subordination and violence have been used extensively in warfare and conquest, from the sexual slavery of tens of thousands of comfort women during Japan's military occupation in China and Indonesia to the current sexual exploitation that unfolds inside the US military bases in the Philippines. It is not an accident that the United States shows up in 7 of the 8 categories of historical violence in Figure 16. This process did not begin in the 1890s with the development of modern imperialism. It can be traced back to 1492 with the first European invasion of the Americas. In October 2023, out of 193 members of the UN, only the US and Israel voted against ending the illegal embargo and blockade against heroic Cuba. When an initial draft resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza was drafted on 16 October 2023, not one single white member of the US House of Representatives initially signed it. There is a through line from the Portuguese slave traders in West Africa to the Israeli and US genocidaires in Palestine. History and definition of hyper-imperialism. Prehistory. The prehistory of modern imperialism began in 1415 with the advent of European maritime expansion. Africa was the first victim, followed by the colonization of the Americas and the genocide of millions of indigenous peoples, and then the rapid dependence by Europe and its settler states on blood-soaked capital from human slavery, which lasted 400 years. Britain's existence as a modern power started with the vampiric dependency on the blood of slaves and colonial laborers. The British were responsible for millions of deaths in the Atlantic slave trade and, and its colonial conquests. Slave labor in the Americas, as well as the British capture of a good part of Spanish and Portuguese colonies' surplus, provided the special ingredient to so-called primitive or originary accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation, the term used by Marx in Capital. US imperialism, in addition to starting as a racial project, has a unique path of capitalist development, including the following: a highly profitable capitalist form of slavery, a state unbridled in its expansion in a large territory without any holdovers from feudalism, the only major imperialist country whose territory was not militarily attacked by other imperialists, an imperial power beginning after Europe had already divided the world, a self-defined unlimited power through the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, as well as concepts such as manifest destiny and US exceptionalism. Since the advent of modern industry, the capitalist world system has consisted of 2 successive periods of dominance by a single capitalist power, first the UK and then the US. From the late 18th century to World War II, Britain was considered the dominant force in international finance. However, this openly collapsed when Britain abandoned the pound's convertibility to gold and ended the gold/pound standard in 1931. In reality, U.S. dominance was clear from World War I, and acknowledged U.S. hegemony began in 1945 with Europe in tatters. At the core of the imperialist system, therefore, is what can be called the Anglo-American project. The size of the U.S. economy overtook Britain's in the 1870s, but U.S. per capita GDP (PPP) did not equal Britain's until the 20th century. By 1913, the U.S. economy was twice the size of Britain's in GDP. However, it was not until 1945, with the U.S. being 5 times greater than the U.K., that U.S. hegemony was fully and formally established. At that point, the U.S. was manufacturing more than half of the products in the world. History. Vladimir Lenin's work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1916, drawing heavily on the work of Rudolf Hilferding's 1910 book Finance Capital, explained the rise of finance capital during the last period of the 19th century, marking the shift from classical liberal capitalism to finance-driven imperialism. The increase in the organic composition of capital meant that greater and greater outlays of capital were needed to expand production. This went beyond the ability of most individual capitalists engaging in classical competition, leading to domination by oligopolies and monopolies, with the reorganization of the financial system to meet their requirements. In parallel with this were technological changes. The switch from steam power to electric power in the 1890s saw a leap in the productive forces and of factory production. Higher energy efficiency, lower maintenance, decentralization, a reconfigured factory floor layout, mass production, and a massive increase in the division and socialization of labor. This type of rapid change in the productive forces happened again later with the invention of the transistor and the rise of computers. Lenin noted 5 characteristics of this new stage: the rise of finance capital and the financial oligarchy, the concentration of production and monopolies, the export of capital, the rise of monopolist cartels, which shared the world among themselves, and the completion of the territorial division of the whole world amongst the largest capitalist powers, along with the increasing conflict between the imperialist states. These developments meant that a new highest and last stage of capitalism had begun, i.e., the stage of modern imperialism. There cannot be another new stage of capitalism, as a system with no competition would not be capitalism. Lenin's book was written on the eve of the Soviet Revolution. Once the Soviet Union was formed, the conflict between labor and capital changed qualitatively and was no longer solely a domestic contradiction within countries, but included contradictions between states with a different class basis. Modern imperialism fully inherits the history of the Europeans' project's domination and exploitation of the world. Lenin defines super profits, a result of modern imperialism, as, quote, a surplus of profits over and above the capitalist profits that are normal and customary all over the world, unquote. Post-World War I, international capitalist divisions against intensified during the Post-World War I, international capitalist divisions again intensified during the Great Depression, 1929-1939, as various imperialist powers locked their economies behind tariffs and other barriers. Before the end of World War II, the US-led reorganization of the global financial system was agreed to in Bretton Woods in July 1944. The convertibility of the main currencies into the US dollar and the US dollar into gold established the supremacy of the new green gold. To make sure its regulations were implemented and followed, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, later the World Bank, were established. These two institutions have been key pillars of US domination over the global south since then. Post-World War II. 1945 saw the decisive victory by the United States among the capitalist powers, and the US dollar began its domination. The period from 1945 to 1971 was an expansionary phase of US imperialism. The US did suffer significant political losses during this period, including a number of newly formed socialist projects. However, confident of its own productive supremacy, the US began a radical reorganization of the global capitalist system after World War II. It dismantled tariffs and other protectionist measures that it deemed unnecessary to its own advancement, but retained subsidy measures that advantaged its own capitalist firms. The post-World War II new globalized organization of world capitalism differed significantly in its international structure from the pre-1945 capitalist system. It achieved a more rapid development of the productive forces than the era of the previous colonial empires. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, behind the veneer of free trade, there were always monopolies, as Karl Marx said with respect to Britain. The US further developed this domination through imperialist monopolies guarded by an international military apparatus. Formed in 1949, NATO initially had three objectives. First, to stop the spread of the communist specter into Western Europe. Second, to guarantee the military subordination of all other imperialists to the US. And third, to create a military bloc to contain and eventually overthrow the socialist bloc countries. The US also began the domestication of the European elite and elicited their support for the North Atlantic Project through economic integration and dependency, symbolized by the Marshall Plan beginning in 1948, and political subordination, such as through institutions like the Bilderberg Meeting beginning in 1954. The US had three objectives in the colonial world. First, finalize the defeat of European control and remove barriers to US economic interests. Second, prohibit their alignment with the socialist bloc. Third, defeat any communist-inspired or led revolutionary projects. Outside a few exceptions, such as Cuba and the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, the US never had the full aim or desire to rule or manage the full scope of political, economic, and social relations at the local level in what was then called the Third World. Using military power, covert operations, economic inducements, and American soft power, the US developed a strategy of neo-colonialism, nominal political independence, and near total economic subordination. The first institution responsible for the conscription of Europeans into the US hegemonic project post-World War II, the IBRD, pivoted to its work in the Global South once the Marshall Plan kicked in. Neoliberalism. The next phase of imperialism is generally called neoliberalism. It emerged as a response to the economic stagnation that began in the 1960s, which became acute by the crisis of 1974 and the political threat of left-led third world projects. Neoliberalism was first experimented with in Chile 1973 and Argentina 1976 by the Chicago Boys under Milton Friedman. Both were implemented through bloody coups d'etats that killed tens of thousands of people to eradicate support for left projects with support from the US. The elections of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 in the UK and Ronald Reagan 1980 in the US paved the way for its global ascendancy. The US had become, in current terms, a debtor nation by 1981. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 enabled the US to engage in a more naked imperialist projection, especially in the military realm. Salient features of neoliberalism included the following. The world experienced economic globalization and the financialization of monopoly capitalism, with super-imperialist financial monopoly privileges created by the US sustaining the removal of the US dollar from the gold standard. The US aggressively extended its intellectual property rights over the whole world and achieved near-perpetual global monopolies. The tangible goods economy was subordinated to the virtualized economy. Large areas of petty production were ruthlessly destroyed. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank consistently pursued austerity policies that impoverished and saddled the Global South with large levels of debt. That debt could only be repaid through exporting things that the Global North would pay for in US dollars. Unlike any other bank, the World Bank got to author its creditors' economic policy, shrinking the state and deflating local currency to secure the primacy of the US dollar. Privatization and closures of the public sector, the withdrawal of the state role in the economy and society, especially in the Global South, and increased casualization of labor were core demands of their policies. This resulted in increased poverty and inequality, such as the intensification of women's unpaid reproductive work. The disarticulation of factory production and supply chains, helped by huge technology changes and US subsidied oil prices, created not only massive increases in productivity, but huge advantages to global capital and its multinational corporations at the expense of the working class. Capital was easily able to move parts of the production between various small, weak global south countries and late entrant industrial global south countries like Brazil and South Africa suffered deindustrialization. Socialism and China's large size protected it from this fate. There was a shift from production to speculative finance and monopoly rent seeking capital, a strong deregulation of financial markets all over the world, and a revolution in communication technologies made possible huge flows of financial speculative capital in real time. A new advanced form of monopoly production and circulation became evident in multiple sectors of the economy. Notably, within the rise of digital monopoly capital, a few monopolies and oligopolies, such as Google, dominate the whole world except for China, Russia, Iran, DPR Korea, Cuba, and a few others. There was a growth in the coercive state, growing high levels of inequality, and a rise in neo fascist populism. The rise of Western cultural, political, and foreign policy hegemony was possible due to the pervasiveness and economic monopoly status of US technologies, including Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Twitter. Michael Hudson's work on super-imperialism, 1972, describes the great defeat of the rest of the world when the US abandoned the gold standard. Rather than buy gold to maintain their currencies, the US forced other central banks to recycle their dollar surpluses into buying US Treasury bonds. This enabled it to force the rest of the world to pay its debts, including the debts incurred from the war against the people of Vietnam. The US became a debtor nation, but was able to outsource its debt through the instrument of the Dollar Wall Street complex. Technology and soft power. Accompanying this process were tremendous changes in technology and the development of the productive forces. Semiconductors, for example, saw a 100 billion fold increase in transistor density between 1954, when the first single working silicon transistor was created, and in June 2023, with the release of the Apple M2 Ultra chip with 134 billion transistors. The US tech sector power came into existence first due to the importance of technological advancement to the military industrial complex, and second to the US dominance in world trade that allowed them to flex their commercial muscles to reinforce the centrality of Silicon Valley. Thus, Silicon Valley is both an enabler of core state military intelligence functions and one of the beneficiaries of it. The underlying nature of what is called the network effect allowed for rapidly established natural monopolies and oligopolies in many technology areas. Like phone exchanges of 100 years ago, once a company like Google passed a threshold of market share in search functions and monetized it, they became an oligopoly. Technologies like cloud computing enabled Amazon to move from being solely a retail industry monopoly to challenging Google and Microsoft in new markets. The term soft power was developed by Joseph Nye in the late 1980s, but it is just a label for the extension of the aspect of Gramsci's concepts of hegemony to US imperialism. The following industries are part of US global hegemony: culture, information, entertainment, nonprofits, NGOs, academia, and think tanks. All of these rely on a common centralized communications industry, which covers undersea optical cable satellites, telecommunications networks, massive data centers, digital communication firms like Twitter, X, Facebook, and Google. There have been approximately 5 stages of communications technologies in the last century. 1. Mass medium radio, the telephone and talkies, 1920 to 1950. 2. Television and the rise of the Madison Avenue advertising, 1950-1970. 3. Digital revolution, the wide-scale growth of the internet, which actually began as a US military project in 1969 from 1980 to 2000. 4. Mobile and first generation social media, 2000 to 2005. And 5. Pervasive mobile, smart devices, and OTT streaming video monopolies like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, CGI, augmented and virtual reality, and soon AI influenced media, 2005 to the present. Each of these 5 generations of technologies were commercialized and then weaponized under the watchful eye of US military and intelligence agencies. Hollywood is infamous for these ties. The 5th generation of technologies represent a quantitative and qualitative leap in capacity. US tech and media companies, proxies for US hegemony, now effectively control the bulk of voices that the youth of the global south hear. While X may be declining and was mainly a space for the chattering classes, Facebook and Instagram and streaming services like Netflix penetrate the lives of billions of the working class. Let's take the case of India. During the first 10 months of 2023, there were 510 million unique internet viewers in India who spent a total of 371 billion hours with 2.9 trillion views. 105B of these hours were spent on social media, 74B on entertainment, 10.5B on news, 10B on retail, and 12.8B on other, mainly finance. During the month of October 2023, those ages 18 to 24 years old spent on average 940 minutes on Instagram, 708 on YouTube, 387 on Facebook, and 117 on X. For all ages, the time spent on Facebook, Instagram, and X has more than doubled since January 2020. During October 2023, the following OTT video streaming led in millions of viewers: 170M Disney, 99M MX Player, Indian firm reportedly under talks with Amazon, 92M Geo Cinema, Reliance, Paramount, and James Murdoch, and others like ZEE5, Netflix, and Sony. Despite the rise of Bollywood, Hollywood is still present in India. Globally, Western media has used 4 types of censorship with social media: shadow banning or ghosting, secret suppression of viewers, white and blacklists, prioritizing desirable content, deprecating or eliminating unwanted content, private non-visible algorithmic manipulation, and now even direct removal and suppression of content and/or users. An estimated 73% of internet traffic is conducted by so-called bad bots, including state-controlled fake user accounts by the United States and Israel in particular. More than half of this traffic uses evasion techniques to mimic human behavior. These techniques are systematically deployed for a range of US soft power campaigns, including for elections and popular sentiment. The Financial Times, noting America's cultural supremacy, worries on behalf of the empire thus: to retain immense cultural reach is a wonderful cushion for a post-peak superpower. The trick is not to fall asleep on it. However, the level of detailed control of every single phone call, message, and keystroke by US intelligence results in very high stakes for the global south. Digital sovereignty requires serious attention and cannot be dismissed. Fictitious capital. Karl Marx critically analyzed the rise of fictitious capital in Volume 3 of Capital. The latest report from the Bank for International Settlements reports that the total notional value of outstanding derivatives, the 3 types of which are interest rate, foreign exchange, and equity, reached 715 trillion US dollars at the end of June 2023, up 16% in 6 months, over 4 times the world GDP, and over 7 times the world GDP in current exchange rate (CER) terms. The gross market value of these derivatives was nearly 20 trillion US dollars. Hedge funds such as Bridgewater Associates and private equity firms such as BlackRock engage in this hyper-speculation. One analogy used to help explain derivatives is that if you stand between 2 mirrors at a slight angle to each other, you can see a long series of images of yourself. You remain real, but the images are ephemeral. Whilst the capital is fictitious, the results are not. The expropriation of the natural goods and companies of the global south now happens at the scale of trillions of US dollars at a speed of milliseconds. 2008 to 2022, a transition. The defeat of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a new feeling of eternal confidence in imperialism from US capital. Now they could expropriate the markets of the former Union and have the sense of accomplishing manifest destiny. The idea of the end of history and the emergence of the sentiment of unilateralism dominated the thinking of the Council of Foreign Relations and other strategic US institutions. Confronted with a decline in the rate of capital creation in their economies, and as financialization and intellectual property rights enhanced the prevalence of monopolies, a larger proportion of capital avoided productive investments and increasingly sought short-term gains, becoming even more speculative. In 2007-2008 financial crisis, what we call the start of the Third Great Depression, meant that previous tools to fight stagnation provided increasingly ineffective. China's imperviousness to this crisis added to the alarm of the global north. The following 14 years saw a transition period marking the end of the neoliberalism phase. From the early 2000s until 2022, major shifts began to take place. Some accelerated the consolidation of capital, others signaled the beginning of an existential crisis of capital. 1. The most important single change was the rise of China as the largest economy in the world when measured by purchasing power parity, PPP. 2. The global south moved from 40% of world GDP to 60% when measured in PPP. 3. The Third Great Depression led to a further drop in GDP growth rates. By 2022, 10-year average per capita growth rates in Europe were less than 1% and in the US 1.5%. 4. European and Japanese capital were denationalized, accelerated by the rapid changes to the capital markets. They are now fully integrated, dependent on, and subordinate to the US on fundamental issues. China consolidated itself as a socialist project, and the Western hope for a new Chinese Gorbachev completely failed. 6. NATO countries increased the number of their global military interventions, but were confronted by a series of defeats, such as in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even to an extent Syria. 7. The US decision to expand NATO into Eastern Europe and use Ukraine as a proxy at the center of the move to control Russia resulted in an important military conflict between nuclear powers. 8. The US, facing relative economic and political hegemony, began to massively expand the use of sanctions, lawfare, tariffs, and seizure of foreign currency reserves. 9. To attempt to stop China's technological advance, the US began using tariffs and protectionism. It began a full-fledged soft power attack on China and started a new Cold War. 10. Major voices in the US ruling class openly talk of the possibility of using its military hegemony to block China. Since they have also lost Russia, at least with Vladimir Putin in power, the US is focused on planning how to complete their historic mission to subordinate Eurasia once and for all. This would ultimately entail the denuclearization and potential dismemberment of both Russia and China. Periodization of imperialism. Imperialism has changed over the last 100 years. We can roughly describe a few key periods as follows. 1890 to 1916, the rise of modern imperialism. 1917 to 1939, the birth of the Soviet Union, the decline of British hegemony, continued extreme inter-imperialist rivalry, the rise of fascism, the spread of socialist ideas across the world, and the Great Depression. 1940 to 1945, the worldwide battle against fascism and German and Japanese aggression. 1945 to 2008, the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the era of US hegemony within the imperialist camp, the advance of national liberation struggles in the global south, and end of direct colonialism, the rising importance of socialist projects like Cuba and Vietnam, dramatic changes in the productive forces, and numerous wars in which the US murdered tens of millions. This period could be subdivided into two parts: the so-called golden era of US imperialism during the 1950s and 60s, followed by the 1970s and the turn to stagnation and neoliberalism. 2008 to 2023. The false hope of US unilateralism was replaced with an awareness that a powerful non-white socialist project would, within a lifetime, overcome the US economically. In 1918, on the 73rd day of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Vladimir Lenin left his office at the Smolny Institute, Petrograd, and danced in the snow. He celebrated the fact that the Soviet experiment had outlasted the Paris Commune. On 18 November 2023, the People's Republic of China marked 27,077 days of existence, exceeding the duration of the Soviet Socialist project. As noted by President Xi Jinping, we are entering a period not seen in 100 years. In summary, these changes show a transition to what is best described as a new stage of imperialism, hyper-imperialism.